We're going to discuss the neighbors in the West. Pakistan has been greatly influenced by what has come from its immediate neighborhood like Afghanistan, Central Asia, and Iran. And in the oceanic sense, of course, beyond the Gulf, the Arab lands, we have been shaped by their culture, their civilization. And today we are at a kind of crossroads because there is some disturbance in the neighborhood and also, in consequence, some disturbance in Pakistan. We are going to discuss these issues with Shahrbanou Tadjbakhsh, who teaches in Paris at the Institute of Political Studies, and Eugene Rogan, who teaches at Oxford and has just written a book, a modern history book on the Arabs. As I see it, Pakistan has been influenced from ancient times from its Western neighbors. There is no doubt that Iran dominates our culture. Urdu language, which is, of course, planted inside the Sanskrit group, but Sanskrit is a sister language of Persian, so it all comes to the same thing. The vocabulary, the grammar is closer to Persian than Arabic. Also, I think in terms of the past rulership, more people have come from the West, from Afghanistan, Central Asia, and Iran, and ruled over India. And after the partition, Pakistan has carried the legacy of this relationship with the Central Asians, with the Afghans, and of course, lately, very strongly with the Arabs. The religion has come from Arabia. In that sense, I think the Arabs have influenced Iran a great deal, Central Asia a great deal, especially under the Abbasids, when there was this movement of a great movement of knowledge, the translation of Greek classics, which spread over Iran, Central Asia, and consequently also to Pakistan and South Asia. I'm going to start with Professor Tadjbakhsh and ask her about how she sees the cultural relationship between Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and Pakistan in modern times, and what are the critical phases?
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. We had a panel yesterday on Iran, and there was quite a lot of interest among our Pakistani audiences, obviously because of this shared common heritage, common culture, common language. I read a poem by Iqbal in the language he wrote, you go outside and all the architecture is very familiar to us. It reminds us that basically there used to be, or there is this Persianate influence in this entire region, and the same thing when we go to Central Asia, we see that, and makes us think, where did this influence come from, and why is it that today this relationship that was so close is no longer the binding tie for this region. First of all, it's not going to be a lesson to you, but as you will remember, after Islam came to Iran, and the Iranians were converted from Zoroastrianism to Islam, the 6th century, the Persians kept their language, the Middle Persian, the Mahlavi, and continued to just change the alphabet to Arabic, but continued to speak in the Persian language. And slowly, slowly, throughout the centuries, tried to keep some kind of a Persian identity under this cloak of a new religion. And I mean, the first rebellion against Umayyads was done by Khorasani, Muslim Khorasani. So these kinds of separation also of these lands from the caliphate and the eastern parts I think that that allowed the Persians to continue to grow a little bit of an independent type of a culture history from the eastern parts of the caliphate. And specifically guarding this language. I think the question of guarding the Persian language, the Middle Persian language, was an extremely important phenomenon. And this kinds of distance allowed this symbiosis to take place because of this kind of a symbiosis to take place with the Islamic and the Persian identity. Like, for example, even with the creation of the Sunnism, you have this, with Shiism, I'm sorry, you have this symbiosis. The third son, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, Imam Hussein, was married to a person with the same name as me, Shahrbanou, who was the daughter of the last Sassanid Persian emperor. So even Shiism is a kind of a combination of the Persian and the Islamic. So then basically the prophets that came after Imam Hussein were this symbiosis. So I think that the importance of the Persians to kind of keep this Persian identity that started because, again, as I said, this distance from the caliphate allowed it to grow. Sufism, for example, was something that also came. There is, of course, Sufism in the Arab world, but the Sufism that grew in the eastern parts is much less Shariat-based and much more based on poetry, which was very much of a culture of our region. And so therefore, even though music was not allowed in religion, I think that the Persianate society, how it actually was able to develop very elaborate forms of music within Islamic music, actually, was something, and also painting and all of that traditions. Even when the kind of a symbiosis of this culture with the Turks and the Persians, the Turks also adopted quite a lot of this language and this mode. Even I'm sure that you will know this and maybe agree or not, but the Turks adopted, Turkic empires adopted this Persian culture. They adopted the Persian language. Even the Persian language became the language of the administration, the Turkic became the language of the military, and the Arabic always the language of jurisprudence and law. Right? So this, and so empires after that, I mean, the dynasties all adopted this kind of Persian language, thinking about, for example, even the Timurids when they came to Central Asia, Turkic dynasty, Turkic-speaking dynasty, but a very Persian culture. They built up Samarkand, they built up Herat, they brought all this architects from the Persian world, and the Persian world was actually, and the people from the modern Iran actually migrated quite a lot in order to expand this art. I think what happened also after the Mongol invasion, basically, all of these artists moved down to subcontinent with the and created this Mughal. Again, this expansion of Indo-Iranian also cultural sphere, which continued to develop the music, the literature, but again with this kind of Persian root, Persian cultural root. And that is what is evident when you go out into the architecture here. But I think it's after the 15th century when we have this kind of a more separation, because when the Safavids came to Iran, they insisted on being different from the Ottomans, and so therefore they adopted this Shiite religion, which was a little bit more dogmatic, us versus them. It's a kind of symbiosis, maybe it's the end of the symbiosis at that time. So this us versus them, the Ottoman Empire develops much more strongly, the Central Asians become very isolated, and I think after the 17th century, the story of modern Central Asia, which I can talk about if you want, is actually very much separated and basically decline. And then, the Indians, with what happened to the subcontinent, you would know better. I think that this separation happened. So in this, after the 17th century, I think that this entire Persianate culture fell victim to the issues of economy, because when the routes opened, for example, when the maritime routes opened, the Silk Road was very much neglected, so therefore you had less advantage to have these types of ties. I think that it also fell victim to these ideologies of Sunni Shiite, us versus them, this kind of most exclusive type of an identity. So, and then we get to the modern period. Shall I go on?
I think I want you to stop here so that I can come back to you again.
Yes.
Professor Rogan, let's talk about the Arab struggle against Western dominance and then the aspiration towards democracy and its relationship with Iran. There was a time when everybody accepted the fact that Iran was an older civilization. Under the Achaemenids, they ruled across the Arab world up to Egypt. And some of their thinking actually seeped into a new religion. For instance, monotheism was born in Iran under the Zoroastrians. The concept of Satan was accepted by the Old Testament, and then it came into the Quran. Karen Armstrong, for instance, wonders where the word deen comes from in the Quran. It's a non-Semitic word, but the fact is that deen is very much a Persian word, and it's a Zoroastrian word. And one is not surprised, but the walls have gone up, and somehow the division has taken place. Where do you think have the states failed in this region?
Thank you so much. I think the title of our panel is very intriguing. It's unusual for a scholar of the Middle East to have his region referred to as our neighbors from the West. But I like this very much. It helps to reorient my thinking. We're now in South Asia, and it allows me an entirely different angle with which to view a region that I've spent most of my life either living in or studying about or teaching about. And in Arabic, there's an expression which says that you pick your neighbors before you pick your house. Adar min qabl al-jar. And the Arabs have been very bad at taking their own advice. I think most Arabs would tell you that they're very uncomfortable with their neighbors. King Abdullah of Jordan likes to quip that his poor country finds itself caught between Iraq and a hard place, meaning Israel. So Jordan recognizes it has very hard neighbors. And I think when Lebanon looks across the frontier at Syria, they too wish that they'd chosen their neighbors before they'd chosen their house. And if we take the big cultural view, as you've invited me to do, this neighborhood that we're discussing today could be broken down by linguistic culture. The Arab world, the Turkish world, the Persian world, and the world of Urdu. And yet it's quite striking how walls have appeared between these cultures. In all the ways that you've outlined, they are permeable walls. Culture will flow through them. Language, the Persian language has been so influential in the Urdu world as it has been in the Turkish world. And Arabic, of course, made its way from that most obscure origin in Hijaz to become one of the dominant cultural influences of all of these cultures. But the derision came very early in the relationship. There was a line of conflict between the Arab world and the Persian world, which very soon became one of disrespect. The term by which Arabs refer to Persians is Ajam. And Ajam has a ring of nigger to it. It's not a pleasant word. One doesn't like to be called Ajam in the Arab world. It's a hostile word. And I'm struck by how little the Arab world knows of the Urdu world. That is to say, the Arab world of the Mediterranean. There, I think there's been quite a cultural break. It's no surprise that this is my first visit to Pakistan. I could have a whole career working on the Middle East and not visit Pakistan. How is that possible? And I think the one place that is breaking with that trend is the very symbiotic relationship that has developed between South Asia and the Persian Gulf states of the Arab world, where all one has to do is open a newspaper and see the amount of attention devoted to politics and society and culture of Pakistan and South Asia to realize that there has been quite a symbiotic relationship between the Arabic-speaking world of the Gulf and of South Asia. But I think that's one born more out of labor migration than out of cultural migration. And I'm not sure that it breeds the degree of respect that such a high level of mutuality should entail. So I think we have work to do to put our houses in order so that the respect for the neighbor might lead to the well-being of the house. The troubles that you've talked about in the region, about trying to come out of European domination, these are problems common to each of these traditions. The struggle for independence in Pakistan to come out of British influence is so matched by the experience of, let us say, Egypt, trying to come at very much the same time out from a very strong British domination. How to write your own rules to live your own history by, rather than feeling as though your history will always be written in the language of a foreign occupier. And in that, I think the common bonds should make the neighbors respond to each other's history and politics with growing sympathy and growing affection. And I would like to see it go that way.
Yeah. Dr. Shahrbanou, let's talk about Iran's relationship with Afghanistan. And since you've just written a book on Afghanistan, I'd like to see you talk about the cultural divisions and culture and the regional identities inside Afghanistan and how they have affected the recent events there.
Thank you. Okay. Well, let me go to Afghanistan through Pakistan, if I may. And I will end because actually the relationship with Pakistan for Iran is actually even more important, and it gets projected. I mean, this book that we wrote is about the projection of the rivalries between the security complexes with Iran and Saudi Arabia, with its with its interest in becoming the regional hegemons. India and Pakistan with their own problems after partition, and Central Asia and Russia projecting onto Afghanistan. So in terms of, for example, I would say that when I was actually doing this book, it was interesting when I came to Pakistan to talk to some people, and also in Iran, people were saying that the way to solve the problem in Afghanistan would be actually to have better relations with Pakistan, between Iran and Pakistan. Because the main problem of this relationship is the kind of projection of the external power, which is the looking for verification to the U.S. in this case. Maybe a little bit more specific, right? The relation between Iran and Pakistan was quite good during the time of the Shah. Both of them were Muslim countries. They were part of the same geopolitical sphere. They had cultural and historical exchanges, etc. But what happened is that after 1979, when the Iranian Revolution happened, the Pakistanis became more scared about the export of the Shiite revolution. During the times of the recent times when Iran is having a lot of problems with the sanctions, Iran became closer to India than it became to Pakistan, because during the Cold War, Iran was much closer to Pakistan and further from India because of the fear of the communist regimes. But after the sanctions, I think India was able to buy the oil from Iran, and so became much closer to Iran and Pakistan because of its fear from what the US will actually punish, how it will punish actually Pakistan for having relations with Iran, became further, was afraid to have these relations, hence had developed much better relations with the Persian Gulf countries and the Arab countries in order to take care of its But one thing about, for example, when the Taliban came to power, and that was a very big division between what happened between Iran and Pakistan, because they were not on the same side, and the Taliban, as you remember, took these hostages in the Mazar Sharif, killed the Iranian hostages. So they were on the different sides of this conflict. Today, there is this kind of understanding that people need to stabilize Afghanistan, and so the kinds of Tajik, Pashtun divisions, or that's why, for example, we see rapprochement between Iran and the Taliban today, because it's a much more of a pragmatic solution in order to have stability for Afghanistan and to counter more forms of extremism which comes with ISIS, etc.
Yeah, we saw that Pakistan found it easier to relate to the Pashtuns of Afghanistan And that didn't work with the Tajiks in the north and the other communities living there. I could also see that Iran could relate very easily with the Tajiks, although they were non-Shia, but they were Dari speaking, which is a brand of the Persian language. Then, of course, one saw Turkey walk in favor of the Turkmen in the north. There is a kind of identity division inside Afghanistan which is obstructing solutions. Even today, when we are moving towards another America-directed peace in Afghanistan, the people of the north are not with it. They think that probably the world is talking only to the Pakhtuns and the Taliban, and somehow they're going to be left out of the deal. Dr. Rogan, what do you think about this crisis which has emerged in Afghanistan because of the larger scenario of Arab versus Iran rivalry?
Well, the Arab relationship to the struggle in Afghanistan has been of fundamental importance to late 20th, early 21st century history. And I think for many idealists in the Arab world, Afghanistan stood as a sort of Islamic utopia. For many of the Islamist parties working in the Arab world, they faced so much repression from military regimes that, because the Islamists were the opposition, repressed them with total brutality. So the only place you could hope to realize your vision of an Islamic polity was in a place where the state had broken down. And the conditions in Afghanistan made that look perfect. And so you found young Arabs being recruited from right across the Arab world, from North Africa, from the Levant, from Arabia, with absolutely no idea about the culture, society, politics, and history of Afghanistan. They assumed it was a simple place, that perhaps it was closer in its practices to the early Islam of the community of the Prophet. They flew through Pakistan. They didn't speak Urdu. They didn't speak any of the languages of Afghanistan. So they were immediately lost. They were not prepared for the journey ahead. And when they reached Afghanistan, they all took refuge in colonies of Arabic speakers, of mujahideen like themselves, which is where, of course, Osama bin Laden begins to create a hostel that becomes known as the base, which becomes known as Al-Qaeda. The problem is, and if you read the memoirs of any of the Arabs who were involved in Afghanistan, their ignorance of the politics on the ground left them vulnerable to being drawn into the factionalism of Afghanistan. Against the advice of all of the leaders who knew the situation better, their advice was fight with Afghanistan in general, but don't get caught up in the differences between Tajiks and Pashtun. But they did. And so, in a sense, they found themselves being drawn into the conflicts of Afghanistan on opposing sides, which was very radicalizing and fragmentary on the Arabs themselves. Unable to realize their visions in Afghanistan as the war came to an end in the 2003 American-led initiative, they returned to their home states, bringing all their prejudices with them, as well as the battlefield experiences that they'd gained, which meant that instead of being able to take away from Afghanistan a common unified vision of what they wished to achieve as an Islamic polity, they came back divided and factionalized in a way which made them very destabilizing to their host countries and to the world at large. And I think in that sense, what was set loose in Afghanistan has come back to the Arab world and to the broader world in a way which they're having a very difficult time in struggling with. Is there the prospect then that in trying to resolve the divisions between Taliban and the government in Afghanistan, that you might begin to undo that damage? I don't think so. I think the damage has been done, and the multiplicity of Islamic ideologies that's emerged after the Afghan experience will continue to be a legacy for the Arab world long after a resolution of the conflict in Afghanistan.
Professor Shahrbanou, Pakistan has had problems dealing with the rise of religion inside and the rise of sectarian politics inside. the Shia community in Pakistan has responded to the revolution in Iran, although some of our scholars, Shia scholars, have been educated in Najaf rather than in Qom. But it turns out that Iran tends to inspire the Shia community, and that leads to more division. How do you think Iran has related to this division inside Pakistan, the rise of sectarianism? Of course, we have Deobandism on the other side, which relates to Saudi Arabia and is hostile to Iran. How should Iran relate to this kind of situation arising here?
Thank you. Sorry, and I feel like I didn't respond correct on the Afghanistan, and I'll come back here as well on this issue. And tying both of these questions together, Iran after the revolution basically had, Iran today has three possibilities to influence, like the ideologically, culturally, economically, and politically. These are the four cards that it has, right? After the revolution, its first interest was to export its revolution. So therefore, the ideology was very important, reaching out to the Shiites of the region. But the Shiites, for example, in the Middle East are much closer to Iran than the Shiites of its Western neighbors. In Afghanistan, the Hazaras, for example, the Tajiks that are the same language, they are the same ethnic group as the Iranians, are not, they're Sunni. So in Central Asia, the Shiites are Ismaili and Badakhshani. So there was not this, and the Hazaras are a small minority that don't have the same ethnicity of the Iranians. So this kinds of closeness between the Iran as a Shiite experiment and the South Asian or Afghanistan Shiism, I think, was something that was not so easy for the Iranians to influence, and especially if it came, against other types of, the more aggressive Sunni type of influences. But then I think that the possibility to influence them culturally for Iran was also much smaller, because the loss of these kinds of, again, the Persian language as a language of economic future, as in this region, most of the past generations know it, but then I think the new generation have not that much of an interest in this kind of a revival of this language, of this culture. Economically, Iran was very much had lots of difficulties to reach out to this region because of the sanctions. In Afghanistan, whatever they try, or with the IPI, for example, the Iran-Pakistan pipeline, that was this project that was of interest of Iran, was also not followed through because of the fear of the sanctions. Today there is an interest in this Chabahar, and we can talk about the future on this possibility to actually revive these economic ties after the sanctions. But I think that the Iranian hands were very much tied also economically. And so therefore that kind of left, and I think that what has happened in the past few years, that Iran was not that interested to actually export its influence. It has a lot of problems within. There's a lot of also pressure on the government to look within and not to have these kinds of external, so the Iran government has had to deal with internal pressure and an environment where it has actually lost its influence. And then so therefore, the influence that it would like to play on the Shiites of the region is, I would say that it's not as, Iran is much more interested in its national problems. Like, for example, that is why the question of the Baluch problem, because it can be an issue of separation, terrorism, etc. for Iranians, is much more interested in this national interest than actually influencing. Although it does look at populations that could be closer to its own culture and religion, like, for example, the Tajiks and Hazara in the region. But I think that Iran has become a little bit more pragmatic about that kind of influence, hence the opening to the Taliban, etc.
Yeah, thank you. Pakistan finds it very difficult to look westwards, to the neighbors, Afghanistan, Iran, and the Arab states. It's very difficult to actually understand what is happening, except in terms of who is against whom. We have been trying to understand what has happened to the pursuit of democracy in this region. although we saw that when Iran was struggling against monarchy, the ambition was, of course, some kind of democratic rule, but what happened instead was something totally different. Actually, that reminds me of our own plight after 1947, because Jinnah founded this country in secular terms. He was very close to Ambedkar. Ambedkar had written, he was an untouchable leader, highly educated, but untouchable leader of India. He had written the book on Pakistan, and Jinnah liked him very much. Actually, a friend of Ambedkar was taken by Jinnah into his cabinet when Pakistan was formed. And within 1 year, we saw that we were not moving towards democracy, but some kind of Islamic ideology. The same thing happened with Iran, and I will now ask you to comment on what has happened to the Arab Spring when people were struggling against dictatorship and definitely vying for democracy, and what happened to it.
Thank you. I think the Arab Spring was a moment in which you saw people rallying against their states in a rejection of what had become not just deeply entrenched autocracies, but autocracies had failed. The rulers of the Arab world came to power in a moment of revolutionary enthusiasm in the 1950s and 1960s, mostly led by military men. And the social contract then was, we will provide your future for you. We'll give you industrialization and jobs. We'll give you good housing, good education, good healthcare system. We'll take care of you from the cradle to the grave on the one condition that you obey. And obedience is built into military culture. When an officer gives an order, soldiers salute and obey. A soldier that disobeys is arrested, imprisoned, and if your disobedience is serious enough, they'll kill you for it. That was the culture that the military dictators brought to the Arab world in the 1950s and 60s. And I think many in the Arab world, coming out of the colonial experience, having lost trust in nationalist elites who had been foreign-trained lawyers, maybe too close to the British and French that they'd been struggling against to deliver total independence, had lost the confidence of the public at large, who saw the military revolutionaries as the men on horseback who could lead them into a new age of strength and greatness. And so they obeyed. And in the beginning, the state did its very best to deliver. And in all the ways that you would measure human development, there was important progress being achieved across the Arab world in terms of healthcare, infant mortality, education, the empowerment of women. There was a record in the Arab world in the 1950s and 60s that Arabs were rightly proud of. But by the time you came to the 1980s and 90s, population growth, economic failure, meant that the state was no longer able to provide for this large and growing population in the 1990s as it had in the 1950s. It was able to look out for a small clique around the autocrat, usually the family and their friends, at the expense of being able to provide for the state as a whole. And as inequality became more pronounced, resentments grew deeper, and as opposition movements began to challenge the social contract, the state responded with oppression. The jails became worse than ever, torture deeper, the numbers terrible. And that's what we saw explode in 2011. We saw people who were tired of the injustice and recognized that the social contract, the state delivers everything in return for obedience, had been broken. They didn't actually call for democracy. I think democracy as an idea had been a wonderful message ruined by one messenger in particular who had been George W. Bush, who made the spread of democracy under American tutelage appear to people in the Arab world as an American project to dominate them and to make their part of the world more comfortable for Israel as a neighbor. And so they resist democracy as a brand. The brand was spoiled. But in their slogans, what they wanted sounds very much like democracy. So they wanted freedom. They wanted the freedom to choose their leaders and to change their leaders by peaceful means. Well, that's a very democratic principle. They wanted freedom from fear. The idea that the state could hold such power over their people through repression and fear was something that was broken very temporarily by the mass gatherings in Bourguiba Avenue in Tunis, in Midan Tahrir in Cairo, around the university in Sana'a. People looked around and saw such large crowds rallying against the state, and they felt brave and they felt strong. And they began to say, you see now, the state fears the people. It's not the people who fear the state. And that was what they hoped to achieve in their revolutions in 2011. But of course, such people power proved very ephemeral. It wasn't actually organized in structures that could allow them, in the moment when the dictators fell, to capitalize on the power vacuum, to seize power. Instead, leaving a power vacuum, you found that it was men with guns rather than men with ideas who were going to be the successors to the dictators. And within 2 years of the brave revolutions across the Arab world, you had a counter-revolution. And that counter-revolution was determined to reimpose the old social contract, to force obedience, to return fear to politics. And for people who had had 2 years of their lives very severely disrupted by revolution, the people in their large majority were just happy to go back to whatever semblance of normality they could achieve. Nowhere more was this clear than in Egypt. The bid to return to just normal life, to jobs, to work, brought the revolutionary movement to an end and saw the Egyptian people embrace the military once again as the people's savior. And we see the results now are an autocracy even more firmly entrenched than what had been known under the time of Mubarak. So is it over? No, I don't think it is. I think the legitimate demands for rewriting the social contract, for, in the expression of the Egyptian Tahrir people, Aish Hurriya, Adala Ijtimaiya. So freedom, bread, freedom, and social justice. I think those fundamental demands are going to be a pressure on autocratic governments for years to come. Look for Arab Spring Mark II, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, but it's coming.
Yeah. We'll move next to the sectarian problem and some of the defects the states have, because some populations have been oppressed over time. For instance, when democracy came to Syria, it was revealed that there was a lot of injustice against one sect. Similarly, in Egypt, the Copts came under pressure. The same thing has happened in Iraq with the Yazidis. So if you move towards democracy, how can you take care of the people who already live there? For instance, giving you the example of Pakistan, it is really strange how similar our evolution has been. Soon after the formation of Pakistan, it was projected that we will have a constitution. And very soon, the earlier preparatory remarks that were made the minorities rather uneasy. And they came to the religious scholars and they said, what will happen to us when Pakistan becomes a real democracy? And they said, you'll have to pay a special tax because you're not Muslims. And I think that is when the friend of Ambedkar, who was then education minister under Jinnah, simply left Pakistan because he knew what was coming. Is it the same kind of thing that we see in, for instance, after Iran became a democratic, they have elections, they have a constitution now. How are the minorities facing up to this? Are they really under pressure or are they happy?
First of all, we when the Arab Spring started, there was also this mini revolution, if you remember, during the elections of the Ahmadinejad.
Absolutely.
And the slogans were, so before getting to the question of the minorities, there was an attempt to get more freedoms for the whole population, especially by and for the youth. Yeah. And the slogan was, Tunes, ve ma natunestim, which means Tunis could do it, Tunisia, but we couldn't. So there's this play on word, Tunis, and we didn't. We couldn't. Because that was, as you remember, that it was the kind of the excuse for it, if I may say this word, was the fact that the President Ahmadinejad was elected not by, was not their vote. They hadn't voted for him, although it's really contested. But this was an opportunity for the youth to come out and to express their desire for more freedoms. But as you remember, the Iranian government did not want to actually have any kind of split out of these Arab, and so there was a very strong crackdown.
But they were very courageous, and at the time we said, you'd never see in the Arab world what the Iranians did in 2009. We were surprised by 2011.
Yeah.
In 2009, we thought impossible the Arabs would do what the courageous Iranians were doing.
Which was what? To come out in the street and do the Twitter revolution.
Challenge?
Yeah. They challenged, a lot of the challenge actually was a social revolution because it was the social network. But what happened is not only that there was a very big crackdown, but I think that the influence of the West actually, when you said Bush talked about democracy, the minute that the West started supporting this revolution, that was the time when, it actually died.
Yeah.
A lot of people were arrested because they were being, said that they were actually collaborating. And that revolution went, I think, it's not dormant. You have to remember, I don't think that in one generation they would like to have two revolutions. So that's another thing. So I think that there is this thirst for having more voices, and actually it's being expressed in the Iranian culture today by the youth, by actually finding alternative ways to express themselves through their feet by immigrating, huge amounts of immigration right now, clandestine as you're seeing this, and through artistic world, etc. Now this happens about the one minority, which is a majority, which is the youth, which is the question of trying to suppress the voices of the youth. But then Iran is a multicultural, multilinguistic, multi-religious society. The Iranian nation was created on this kind of unity of, even though we have multiplicity, we all abide by this geopolitics, this geography of Iran, which was shrinking by every century. It used to be much bigger in every century. So we have to be proud of this Iranian country, Iranian nation, even though, for example, 30% of the Iranian nation is Sunni. I think it's 30% is Turkic speaking. So you actually have quite a lot of different types of minorities. And not necessarily, for example, these 30% Sunnis, we don't have a Sunni mosque in Tehran. And so this is, and many of the Sunni populations are in the border areas, which is always relegated, which is also, where they have their kins across the borders, the Turkmen, the Kurds, the Baluch, etc. And that is the problem of making sure that these kinds of minorities are taken care of economically, is a very big challenge for the Iranian government, especially since there is, if you want to, the interest is actually to have a kind of if you want to have not a revolution, but a problem for the regime, you will actually support these kinds of minorities. And that's the challenge today.
Which reminds me that there is another parallel that I must bring out between Pakistan and Iran. Iran has constitutionally accepted minorities, but has left out one, which is not named, and that is the Baha'is. Pakistan had joint electorates, and then it sort of moved to separate electorates, which means that the non-Muslims cannot vote together with the Muslims. And then we reverted back, and now we have joint electorates, which is a very good development. But somehow the Ahmadis have been left out, just like the Baha'is. So they are non-people. They're living in Pakistan, but they are non-people. I want to come to the question of education in the Arab world, in Iran, and of course in Pakistan. I think there is a crisis point, because now the Prime Minister of Pakistan says there is this English medium education in Pakistan, and there is the Urdu medium, and he doesn't talk about the madrasas He says it is creating two nations, and I'm going to make it into one nation. What is the status of, we know that what is going to happen, and some of us fear that something really negative will happen, because the language is the carrier of ideas, and from way back we know that English has a different message from the non-sequential and non-logical message of the Urdu language, or the local language. I think I read Riza Shamsi's book on English language in India. It was very interesting. There was one person who caused a lot of disturbance in Pakistan by writing a book in Bengali, and that was Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. He wrote his first book, very humane book in English, which is about the suffering of a woman and how she coped in the environment. And then the next novel was in Bengali. And there he expressed something completely different with an inset song called Vande Mataram. And that caused a lot of disturbance because it had stanzas against the Muslims. There was violence. And when India inducted Vande Mataram as the national song, they removed those two stanzas which were against Muslims. And now the BJP wants them back in. Now, the message in Bengali is the same person writing two novels, and the message is completely different. So I don't know what is happening going to happen in Pakistan, but where this problem doesn't arise, for instance, in the Arab world, Arabic is such a strong language. Why is it that in most assessments it is said that in the Arab world or in the Muslim world, education has suffered? What is your comment?
I think people in the Arab world are very conscious that their education system is in serious need of upgrading, that it's not fit for purpose. I think that they see education as a vital tool in social engineering of how you create loyal citizens, support the state, which is fine in terms of preserving political stability. But given population growth, you need jobs. And in the global marketplace, it's the people who can speak English, the global language, and who have the kind of technical knowledge that allows them to harness digital technology and be part of a global workforce working with these tools, that's going to either allow your country to participate in the opportunities of the global economy or be left behind. And for the moment, the Arab world is left behind, there's no doubt. The Arabic language is a unifier, but there is cultural and linguistic diversity even in the Arab world. Very interesting to see how those differences are negotiated. Let us say in Morocco or Algeria, where you have Amazigh or Berber language as a culture that could, you could imagine identity politics leading Berbers away from the Arabic majority. Negotiated better there than, let us say, in Turkey, where Kurdish cultural autonomy creates such tensions around national unity or division around Kurdish-Turkish lines. And so I think the challenge for the educational system, as they try to revise it in the Arab world, is not just to enable people to have the necessary skills to contribute to the economic growth of the nation, but to devise a school system that will protect what remains of the cultural and linguistic pluralism of the Arab world. So under jeopardy, your question about minorities in the region, so under jeopardy. And the two things that seem to be most threatening, the multicultural pluralism of the Arab world of the mid-20th century, which is now so endangered in the 21st, would certainly be religion and nationalism. And so to provide an education system that transcended the limits of nationalism and transcended the limits of religion would be, I think, in the interest of all across the Arab world. But what a difficult time to try and foster that kind of reform.
Yeah.
Thank you. On education, I wanted to say that the problem of Iran actually is its isolation today, and because Iran has put quite a lot of emphasis on actually this kind of good technological education. If you go to Iran, the thirst of students to read is much more than my students, for example, in France. And everything is translated. They have access to the internet through all kinds of resources. If you go to any university in the US, there are Iranian students, including those that are trying to come from Iran.
Yep.
Some very good universities, technological universities are in Iran, for example, Sharif, etc. The problem is the possibility to travel, to study, to abroad, and to export and to make use of this education despite the sanctions. And I think that the big problem is this isolation that is on Iran. If that was lifted, the potential for Iran to actually export its educational model and system, and for example, even just on the question of the textbooks, the Persian language textbooks that were created in Iran for Afghanistan were basically not encouraged to be used by the friends of Afghanistan, saying, well, this comes from Iran, you don't need to do that. This was a purely political decision. So basically, I think that the problem is isolation and the sanctions and the image of Iran today.
I think we have come to the end of our discussion. I'd like the audience to pose questions to our speakers if they like. Any questions?
Got a hand over there, hand over there.
It's a bit more full than I thought.
I know.
Yeah, there is one question. Can you get up and ask it? You have to be a little bit loud. Okay. Okay. I didn't see you, sorry.
I have two questions. They're related. I mean, all of the neighbors to the west of Pakistan are very secure in their national identity. I mean, Iranian people are no doubt where they come from, and so is Turkey, and it's Pakistan, and that's not the problem of culture is so important. Do you think the problem which Pakistan is facing in its neighbors, is it because it is insecure in its own 5,000-year-old heritage, which is actually at a par with whatever, Iranian civilization, Turkish civilization? Do you think it's a cultural problem which makes us look more to the veteran neighbor, elsewhere rather than this whole neighborhood, which is sort of civilization, Chinese civilization, Iranian? That's the first question. Second question is, I've traveled to Egypt and Yemen, and the problem with Pakistanis in general is that they don't travel along in the Arab world. For their pleasure they travel to Dubai, and for religion they travel to Mecca. There is a whole panoply of 21 Arab countries, and obviously this is really contributing to this. Culture is a problem, and this is one problem that they don't want to travel. And similarly the case with our Arab friends. So a lot of stereotypes. If you, for example, ask an Egyptian what is the image of a Pakistani, they will say they are thieves. Even in Pakistan, if you ask anyone about correct. So I can respond. If the problem of culture is really very, very important, it has not been given the attention which it probably deserves now in this situation.
Okay, let them answer. Okay, any of you attempt that?
Do you want to answer the first question on Iran?
No, I just want to say that it's very unfortunate that we do not know each other or want to know each other as much. And I think that there is this problem that I alluded to yesterday about this Westoxification of the Iranians before and after the revolution. Westoxification Gharb Zadegi, which means we thought we are more French than we are actually Easterner, and we would like to be the Paris of the Middle East. And so our view has always been to the West. Before, my parents were Francophone before they, but this has actually continued after the revolution under the Islamic Republic. Today, even from foreign policy, we have to make sure that we are better heard in the West than we look to our own East. And that's why I have a very big problem with the Iran government not taking advantage of its friendly relations, developing them more with Afghanistan, with Central Asia, with Pakistan, where it could have a better neighborhood than actually trying to prove itself constantly with the West. So it's unfortunate. But we could do it at the people-to-people level. That's all.
As for the Pakistanis' connection traveling through the Arab world, Travel is a middle class phenomenon. Yeah. And so if you're lower middle class or working class, you travel only for work. And of that we see a great deal. And I think that it's not the nature of travel that will allow people to appreciate each other's cultures, just because if you've gone to work in a construction site, then you live with fellow workers, you see nothing of the host country. It's actually quite hostile to you, isolates you from society at large. So we're talking then people of means, and people of means from Pakistan, they're global, they're everywhere, and there's no holding the Pakistani back from conquering the world. Yeah. And all I would say is that maybe the Arab world is less attractive as a tourist destination or as a visiting destination than Europe or the Far East or America has been. And even if you're looking for lands of opportunity, I think that the ambitious young Pakistani who's educated in France or Britain or America is going to be looking for work in the West rather than the Arab world, except maybe in that Dubai where the streets are paved with gold.
Thank you. There are more questions. Do we have time? Yeah. 1 minute?
Short answers.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
We're just starting to get warm up.
Yeah, I
know. I really enjoyed this. I have served in Arab countries as a diplomat, Pakistani diplomat, and I was very impressed by the analysis that you did of the Arab Spring, because that's how the progression of events have occurred. But I sometimes wonder that we are now in the 21st century, in the age of information, and there is social media and all kinds of access to information, dissemination of information. So you said that autocracy has again been reimposed, and the counter revolution in a way of a negative kind has taken place. But now, because the Arab countries are behind in many things, even compared to Pakistan. For example, UNESCO report said that all the publications of all the Arab countries together is less than the publications of Spain, for example, in one given year. So, their lack of focus on literacy, education, etc., is even more sad and pathetic compared to what we have here in Pakistan. So, do you think that there will now be some simmering of a kind of social, movement to improve the lot of the common Arab man?
Okay.
Thank you.
I think that the Arab world since 2011 has descended in a cycle of violence and destruction, which has taken some of the greatest states in the region and reduced them to rubble. And so before we see the attention paid towards social and political reform, there will need to be a period of peacemaking and of reconstruction, which I think puts a lot of the really serious business of the Arab world on hold. But in my many years, my many decades of living or studying this region, I've never known it facing such a bleak future. And until the violence bottoms out to enable a reconstruction project, it's very hard to see how one can move forward on the more fundamental issues that you've identified in your question, to prepare the Arab people to resume their contribution to their own societies and to global culture. But it's in a terrible place right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.